of you who are either watching or listening. So, just to say, this is the Planning Committee on the 9th of October 2018. And today we're going to be discussing housing supply in Outer London so that the Planning Committee can prepare for the examination in public of the Mayor's London Plan. And it's the Mayor's planning policies for housing in Outer London that we'll be looking at. But before we do that, I'd just like to go through, before I even introduce our panel as well, I'd just like to go through the housekeeping business so we get that all out of the way and then we can deal with the issue. So I'm going to ask the committee clerk, Teresa Young, to take us through the housekeeping.
Thank you very much, Chair. Members of the public may like to follow the committee on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the discussion on social media using hashtag Assembly Planning and hashtag London Housing.
I forgot to say that. Yes, we do want you to take part on Twitter.
And could I, on behalf of the Chair, please ask everyone to make sure that any mobile phones or other electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions. First item of business, apologies. An apology has been received from the committee's Deputy Chair and Assembly Member Goff. Item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of offices held by Assembly members as set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No, there's no other interests. Item 3, minutes. Can I ask members to agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of July 2018?
Agreed.
Item 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the ongoing and closed list of actions?
Noted.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a change of order of agenda items. In accordance with Standing Order 2.2d, the Chair has agreed to take the agenda items in different order to that set out in the agenda. So committee will next take agenda items 6, 7 and 8 and then return to the main item of business. So item 6, the Planning Committee's work programme. Can I ask the committee to note the report setting out the committee's forward work programme?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to note the work to date on the issue of meanwhile uses, and agree that Assembly Member Copley undertake further work to agree the arrangements for activity relating to meanwhile uses in advance of a future committee meeting on the subject?
Agreed.
And can I ask the committee to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree on the most appropriate way for the committee to consider how it will contribute to the Assembly's work in opposing the expansion of Heathrow Airport and deferred runway?
Agreed.
And finally, can I ask the committee to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree the committee's preparation for and submissions to the examination in public for the draft London plan. And the date of the next meeting will be Tuesday the 20th of November 2018 at 3:30pm in Committee Room 3. Can committee note that? And the Chair has not been informed of any other business, so I'm going to hand back to the Chair to take you through the main item.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, while we're all here, that this is Reece, his last meeting, and he's been absolutely a wonderful supporter of all our work. And he's not leaving the building. He's been stolen or poached or whatever you want to call it. So he won't be with us anymore. But I just wanted to register the committee's thanks for all the work you've done, Reece.
Yeah.
So now, if we can allow our guests to introduce themselves. So if we could start at this end and just say a couple of lines about what you do, so we know who you are and what you do and who you work for.
So my name is Neil Sinden. I'm the director of the London branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England. You may ask what the CPRE are doing here. Well, of course, we have a very strong interest in how we can make better use of urban land in order to reduce pressure, particularly for housing development in green spaces, both within and outside of London. And indeed, the objective of making much better use of wasted space, including through focusing on small sites in outer London, was one of our top 5 priority areas for the London plan that we issued a few months back before the draft was published. So we're pleased to see the policies in the plan, but we also recognise what a huge challenge, particularly having spoken to colleagues from Bexley, what a huge challenge it's going to be to achieve this, what we think is a very progressive, positive agenda.
Fine, thanks.
Right, I'm Robin Brown. I'm from the Hayes Community Development Forum, that's Hayes just north of Heathrow, as a community network trying to progress local projects, but I'm also part of a London-wide network, Just Space, which is a self-help group or network that participates in the planning of London, particularly at the strategic level. And we will be appearing at the forthcoming examination in public on a great many matters.
Thank you.
David Scourfield, Chief Planning Officer for the London Borough of Ealing. Essentially my job is to get development on the ground, and that's what Ealing have been doing for a number of years, and we will continue to do that. I manage the development team, which looks after all of the applications, 6,000 plus, and also the spatial policy team, which obviously has an eye on policies that we're putting forward, but also the London Plan draft is putting forward. And I look forward to the debate with interest as to how we can close the gap between the reality on the ground and the numbers being proposed.
Sam Cuthbert, I'm working the local plans team at London Borough of Ealing.
Good afternoon, I'm Jane Richardson, I'm Assistant Chief Executive at the London Borough of Bexley. Within my particular area come the planners, regeneration, economic development and the skills agenda. Along with the colleague to my right, last December the London Borough of Bexley published a very challenging and exciting growth strategy. In that growth strategy we set out our plans to provide up to 33,000 new homes for London, all evidence-based, all predicated on long-term work with the GLA. That, we believe, is the future offer of Outer London, to provide the homes that London needs in well-planned places, and we are strongly opposed to being given an 8-fold increase.
Get on to that, Jane.
Sorry,
No,
okay, fine.
Sorry, this is just introducing yourselves.
Fine.
It's okay.
I'm Seb Salom. I'm the London Borough of Bexley's Head of Strategic Planning and Growth, so I head up the local plan team.
Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon, I'm Heather Cheeseborough from London Borough of Croydon. I'm the Director of Planning and Strategic Transport. Croydon is extremely pro-growth, pro-development. We've got a huge programme of regeneration underway. We're also very happy to undertake intensification, and we are putting into practice many of, I suppose, the GLA and the government's thinking on intensification, what it actually means and how it happens. So I'm delighted to be asked to this meeting, because we actually live it every single week at Planning Committee.
Hello, I'm Riëtte with Oosthuizen. I'm planning partner at HDA, a multidisciplinary design consultancy specialising in housing delivery. We have 50 years of delivering homes. My team have a specific expertise in working with a number of London boroughs on small sites, so we have been delivering small challenging sites for well over 8 years with boroughs who want to increase their affordable housing delivery. HDA is also known for having done some work around Superbia, which is looking at the capacity within London Outer Borough to intensify. And I have to absolutely stress that we are departing from a point of view that it needs to be set within a well-developed framework of how you want to see growth develop, exactly like Croydon are doing at the moment. But we can talk more about the specific incentives that we think needs to be associated with it.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for that. And now, just a couple of sort of opening questions for myself, and then other members will come in and we'll drill down on the detail. So don't feel you've got to sort of flesh it all out now. We'll come on to it in later questions. But I just want to ask, maybe start with David. I really want to ask you each about how you view the targets, the challenging targets. We have to, we all recognise that inner London has been really accommodating most of the growing population, and the shift in the London plan is towards outer London. But it's a steep increase in the targets, and just wondering how you look at those targets and how you feel that they will, their deliverability, and how they can be delivered.
Yeah, I think, as I say, Ealing has, like Croydon, been very pro-development for a long time, and we continue to do so. From a personal point of view, and perhaps from a borough point of view, the overall target is challenging. Whether it's achievable or not is a combination of factors in terms of obviously the land availability, but also the reality of what happens in the market. And if the market enters an economic downturn, and depending on the Brexit scenario, we might be in a completely different market environment. So that really needs to be taken into account. But certainly we will strive to achieve the uplift in the overall target, but I think like other boroughs and certainly other outer London boroughs, our concern lies with the balance between the small sites target and the overall target. And we particularly feel on several grounds that the small site target will be unachievable from both an evidence base and also from the point of view that it's not really justified in the overall scheme of that complete housing target. So we would probably like some more flexibility in terms of how the small sites target, or small sites quota, let's call it, fits within that overall target. And indeed some further reassessment of actually how the mechanism works and what's being looked at. Because there's a lot
that's useful. Well, we can probe on a lot of that. But so flexibility. Okay, on between the two targets.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Who'd like to come in next? Let's go to Croydon.
We've got currently 1,600 per annum target, which we adopted from local plan in February of this year. So that was an increase. Our new annual target would be 2,949 per year, so quite a significant increase. And we've done quite a bit of work about could we actually deliver that. At the moment, of that approximately 33,000 homes we've got to provide through our local plan over the next 20 years, approximately 10,000 is to come from windfall, which was pretty punchy, we felt, looking at historic rates. To help do that, we've put together an SVD2 on intensification on small sites to actively encourage developers to do it, and that's why we are doing a lot of it at the moment. But looking at what that is actually bringing forward, that's still not going to really hit that target, and it's certainly not going to meet the new target. And so we did a quick bit of work about what it would mean, because our intensification comes a lot from knocking on one big detached house in a large plot and putting back 9 flats. And yes, that increases your
So that already happens.
That is already happening, and it's increasing at a pace, especially with the SVD2 that we brought in. And our local plan had a specific policy that says we encourage small sites and intensification, including the redevelopment of back gardens. So we were up front saying that we're doing it. And we have got specific developers in Croydon who operate that small sites delivery model. And we work with them through pre-apps. And
Can I just say you're already permissive on building on back gardens?
Yes, we do. Our local plan allows it in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So there's quite specific guidance about it, because we do want to ensure that there is still gardens left for the host property and for the new property. So we do allow all of that. But what we worked out with the new London plan target, effectively we'd have to redevelop approximately 40% of our detached, semi-detached and some terraced housing to meet that sort of target through the new London plan target of intensification. So that's 40% of our borough over the next 20 years would have to be redeveloped. And we don't really think that is...
20 years?
Yeah, 20 years. Possible or desirable, because there is obviously a desire to keep the character of the borough. And what we're trying to do is intensification and redevelopment working with the character of the place. So it's not to say that the character stays the same. We recognise that some places will stay the same if it's conservation areas, local heritage areas. There are some areas that we're quite happy to see change because they're a mixed character and they will evolve. And that's the sort of areas in suburbs which have no sort of special designation. And then there will be some that change. You know, for instance, in the town centre of Croydon, an awful lot of that is changing. So we do understand how our borough is made up, and we've done a lot of character work around it. But in terms of deliverability of the target, we do question the sheer quantum of redevelopment of the borough that the new housing target will bring. And we think that at the very least we would have to do an awful lot of proactive site assembly, which we're not against, but we will need funds to do that. We also need the infrastructure, absolutely fundamental.
So we'll come on to a lot of these points later. So Helen, are you saying it's not what we're hearing from Ealing is flexibility between the overall target and the small sites, which is a large proportion of the overall, some flexibility about where you put your priority, and maybe how you make up, rebalance maybe the numbers. But are you saying that it's just the overall target is just too much? It's not to do with the small site target.
It's extremely challenging, that target, because we're already pushing the numbers on our allocated sites and our big sites. So we've got an OAPF in the centre area, which is tall buildings. That number has grown in probably the time I've been at Croydon from about 7,000 to 10,000, 10,500. They're on our big sites in our town centre. So we're already pushing those sites. And we're looking at our district centres, we're pushing them harder. But we are already redeveloping sites further than the London Plan policy is asking in terms of small sites. So it talks about 800 metres, PTALs 3 to 6. We're already doing small site intensification where PTALs are 1B. So I think it's a very difficult target to deliver. That's not to say we're not up for it, and it'd be great if we could get some assistance in terms of infrastructure, better trams, better buses, and some housing. But it's going to be really, really tough.
Fine, okay, you've covered a lot. It's a lot. There are things here for members to pick up on as we go through other questions. So, shall we go to Bexley? Jane.
Having taken too much time already, I'll be quick. I'd like to echo the points that have already been made by some of my colleagues around flexibility and so on. With densification, I should say we also have a permissive policy in Bexley, so we are not anti-growth per se, and 2/3 of the small site schemes that come forward get approved. But there is a challenge about the market itself and the market response, and there is a big challenge around infrastructure. So, for an example, just looking at some of our friends and neighbours, for Bexley, within our town centres, PTAL ratings are 3 at best. Within 100 metres of our railway stations, and we have no tube or metro or tram, PTAL falls very quickly away from 3 to 1 within 100 metres. On a good day, we have around 8 trains per hour AM peak. Now, if you compare that to our colleagues in Lewisham, in Wandsworth 42, Barking Dagenham 37 and so on, I think we have to make the very big plea that it's around infrastructure investment to really enable the kind of scale of shift in development. It's absolutely fundamental, and that's why our growth strategy talks about very significant growth in the north of our borough, predicated on extending Crossrail from Abbey Wood across the north. The idea that we can shift from where we're providing 110, 120 homes per annum to 860 per annum with no further investment, no further infrastructure in a borough that does not have wasted space, but similar to Croydon would rely on the demolition of the semi-detached heartlands of London's suburbia, is an extraordinary challenge. Not least, it assumes that the people living in those homes would be happy to be displaced.
Okay. Riëtte, do you want to come in here? Because you've done work on what would happen if semi-detached homes were to be demolished.
I think there's a
Could you come close to your mic?
I'll try. Sorry, I'll try and be a bit louder. So there's a number of points that I think that comes to mind. I think for us, and I completely agree with the boroughs, the way that they say it, that some of these targets and the fundamental implications of the extent of the target could be really problematic. Where we started with our work is that, and this was probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago, was that we had to think about different scenarios of how London can grow. If you start looking at, it might not be the best way to use the green belt or metropolitan open land, then it's worthwhile to recognise that there is capacity. There is capacity within London. A lot of London's suburbia is developed about 22, 23 dwellings per hectare. That's not a sustainable density. So doubling that density is more of a sustainable density. So there is potential. And we've done several pieces of research, and you can approach it in various different ways. There's specific types of suburban homes, and it's not covering all types of suburban homes. We started our suburbia work with semi-detached homes, a plot of 8 by 40 metres, where you can actually, with very specific design coding and looking at planning tools such as local development orders, you can create capacity potentially for an additional home, and you can also create additional equity for the person owning that property without necessarily affecting character. I think character is the second point. It's really important. The problem that we've had in actually trying to bring forward a number of small sites that boroughs themselves wanted to build is that character is interpreted differently in each single borough, and it's not clear. There are no clear rules about what actually affects character and what character is. So we've run appeals where actually character came down to just a question that a plot need to have a front and a back garden to actually exemplify suburban character, and I don't think that's necessarily accurate, and we do have to think about what is a suburban character for the future of London to accommodate its growth. I think something else that with the new NPPF and the new London plan, there is an awful lot of responsibility placed on local authorities to actually be very proactive in terms of design coding, and I think we do all need to think about how boroughs can be or do need to be supported in actually, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what design coding is. There's other planning tools that could be used. It's quite clear that there's a resource implication about managing this level of growth appropriately. And then I completely agree that if we are looking at this level of growth, we do need to think about either capturing value or setting in place ways of addressing social and other infrastructure at the same time. So yeah, that's just a few points.
Yes, no, they're good points. So we'll come back to some of those points in later questions too, especially the tools that boroughs need, the area design code and other tools that they need for this. Do either of you want to come in, Robin or Neil, on this?
Can I just chip in? I mean, just to say, it's really interesting to hear that there, what I've heard is that there's a general level of support for the kind of direction of thinking that is embodied in the kind of the draft London plan in terms of the need to reshape and remodel outer London boroughs. But there are some very serious practical challenges in seeking to realise that ambition. My having heard what Riëtte's just said as well, I mean, my thought is that we need more than a policy in a London plan, and willing and able outer London boroughs to actually deliver what is actually quite a radical reshaping of a large part of London's surface area, if the ambition is to be realised. And I'm just wondering, how can an organisation like CPRE, which is a relatively small campaigning NGO, help by way of seeking to influence national government in terms of national planning policies? I'm very conscious that until not long ago we had policies in national planning guidance around the phasing of land release in order to encourage brownfield wasted spaces being used first. We don't have such an approach to phasing anymore, and I'm just wondering, if a national policy support for that kind of approach is something worth revisiting.
Well, we will ask people if they've got ideas.
And the other thing is that one of the things we call for in our kind of sort of manifesto, if you like, for the London Plan was the establishment by the GLA with support from others of an urban land commission, where we can share and sort of examine and probe the kind of evidence that Riëtte's talked about that has come through from HTA, but there are also others as well. Earlier work being done by the Urban Task Force in the 90s, I think, is well worth revisiting in terms of urban capacity. And I think that if there's some, this does present an opportunity to think about institutional capacity to deliver what I think it would be quite a significant change. for London. And I just would also emphasise that I don't think that, whilst we strongly support policies in the London plan to make better use of land within London, the core GG1 policy or whatever it is, I think is a very well... GG2 policy is a very important one for London. It's not only important for how we use land in London and how we can safeguard green space over, as well as making better use of existing developed land, it's vitally important for issues like climate change, air pollution, tackling transport needs. We need to recognise that the agenda for modal shift that TfL are promoting, 80% of all journeys by active or sustainable travel modes by 2040, I think it is. These are all policies that I think are potentially aligning with the sites for making better use of small sites. Sorry, the policies for making better use of small sites in the draft London plan.
Thank you for that. Robin, would you like to come in?
Yes, I'm not actually a spokesperson for London Borough of Hillingdon, but we, the good people of Hayes, do share some of the concerns of the council, that the housing target is particularly challenging. It's tripling the actual gross out target compared to the 2015 London plan, and half of that new target is expected to be delivered from small sites. But at the moment, over the past 8 years, the actual small site delivery has been quite small, and it would mean a quadrupling of the output from small sites in order to achieve what the GLA is expecting. So that for us, that's particularly perplexing and challenging. And there are ramifications or implications from the spatial designations of using PTAL 3 to 6 in addition to the town centre, 800 metres of town centre boundary, because the PTAL 3 to 6 includes...
Does everyone know what PTAL is? It's public transport accessibility levels. Just in case people watching and listening don't know.
Yeah, well, anyway, areas of reasonably good public transport accessibility. So we've got a major high street, Uxbridge Road, and there's a good deal of employment located on the frontage and behind the frontage of Uxbridge Road. And those will be at risk. And the GLA's own commission document, High Streets for All, says that 70% of high streets within Greater London are under potential threat because they don't have any safeguarding designations, i.e. they're outside town centres. And these high streets are particularly important because 47% of businesses outside central London are located in a high street. So I just wanted to flag up the vulnerability of high streets to the small sites policy.
I think, by the way, there is we've made representations on this, and there is an amendment, and those kind of buildings are not going to be seen as small sites. They're much more under threat, by the way, from the government's permitted development rights. We can't do anything. Although we've lobbied, we can't do much about that. One thing you said many things which were interesting, but one particularly was the fact that you've had a very low take-up of development on small sites in the past, and that's probably true of most round the table. Maybe not, but do say if it's not true when you come on to the next question. But I think we've now got a presumption in favour of development on small sites, which should, that includes conversions as well as new build, which I think should make a difference. But one thing we want to explore is what are the barriers then? Is a presumption enough? And what are the other barriers? I just want to ask, do you want to...
Yes, I just wanted to respond to your point about the minor modifications. My reading of the minor modification, that it was for designated industrial or employment sites. And the point I'm trying to make is
no.
These aren't designated. Okay.
No, for non-designated. They've been deliberately removed. from being small sites. I hope I'm not dreaming that. No, I'm pretty sure that's true. Recent check-up.
I got it to F7.
Is designated industrial or employment sites.
That's different though. I mean, these are little high street things we're talking about, not. Anyway.
Yeah.
Hang on a minute. We'll come back to you on that if I've got this wrong, because we did make representations, and I swear I read that it had been changed. Can I ask Jane Bexley, just talk a bit about the small sites. How are they going to look on the ground? I mean, what are you thinking of in terms of the development of small sites?
Well, I think what it's going to look at the ground is very difficult. As I said before, I would commend our growth strategy as our strategy rather than small sites. But what we see in Bexley is that there are very little infill sites. So what tends to come forward are corner plots on residential roads, the conversion of small dwelling houses. Unfortunately, we did have to take out an Article 4 direction around some of the conversions we're seeing in our housing stock, because there was a level of exploitation going on of vulnerable households. They are very small scale. They're usually 2, 4, 6, 8. They very rarely trigger any affordable housing within the small sites that come forward in Bexley. I think without investment in infrastructure, that is very likely to be the case, because the market simply isn't there for a big return for developers. So I would imagine it will just be more of the same. We will continue in actuality to provide 100, 150, 200 units per annum. We will never get anywhere near 860. It's absolutely impossible.
Can I ask you, you've got quite large development sites in Bexley.
Yes.
I mean, could you be getting more from those?
Well, I commend our growth strategy to you, I keep saying this. And Mr. Salom and colleagues and I are in some very encouraging pre-app discussions with a number of developers who wouldn't have even bought in our borough before the growth strategy were published. And we are moving much more into that growth strategy territory. But to really drive forward, we do need a transport infrastructure. And the developers will talk about this again and again. Our land values are generally the lowest in London. We tend to swap places every other data set release with Barking and Dagenham, but they tend to be the lowest in London. And I would come back to one of the stats around connectivity. We have 8 trains an hour, AM peak, and they have 37. It's just the market, it's just the nature of the place. But we do have some large-scale developments. We have the biggest housing zone in London, which was delayed because we had to go to public inquiry, where the inspector found in favour of us in full. So that will be progressing imminently. Part of its charm, of course, is it's in Abbey Wood. And what does Abbey Wood have? Abbey Wood has a Crossrail station. So it really is something around the nature of the place. And listening to my colleague talking about the character and design, well, Outer London is not one homogenous bit of a donut. We are all different, and we do have different markets. We're not anti-growth. Read the growth strategy, but we are realist, and we do have genuine concerns that we won't meet these targets, and then we will be losing out at appeal because we simply aren't meeting a number that's utterly impossible.
Talking now about small sites. So
yes.
If you, because of the target, you think you'll get more appeals?
I think that's pretty inevitable that we will get more appeals, because we simply won't be able, we simply will not be able to deliver an 8-fold increase in small sites. They just do not exist. They simply aren't there. So the large sites, that's fantastic. We've just recently delighted that the Mayor did not call in a large railway scheme in Bexley Heath. Although Bexley Heath is our major town centre, it's at least 1.5 miles from the railway station. Nevertheless, we're really thrilled with that, and we think that starts to show a step change. So we really are up for it. Broken record, we need support with the infrastructure, but small sites isn't the way forward.
So, Ealing, can I ask you, because you talked about rebalancing I don't quite know how you meant it, but basically, if there were fewer in the small sites, or is it just the target that's the problem?
I think it was rebalancing in terms of applying a target to both the overall numbers and also explicitly to small sites, because there is a feeling that, as with other boroughs, if you really are pro-growth, and if you at the end of your year or at the end of the period are somehow achieving that very challenging overall target, but you're not achieving the sub-target, the small sites, then why should you be challenged or penalised on that particular element of it when you're providing the housing as such? So the flexibility is perhaps to look at, if you're going to keep a challenging target, you keep a challenging target, but you don't penalise authorities for not meeting that target explicitly by a sub-target for small sites in itself, because we are hearing that's very difficult.
Okay, it's really interesting, I think, this. What Bexley just said about appeals. If you have a target for small sites, does that mean that you're likely to get appeals on small sites?
I think it's likely. Whether you could quantify this at this moment in time is difficult, but I just think the way the development management process works, the engagement with communities, the way councillors may feel if more schemes are coming to committee and being overturned, I think there is a likelihood of that. I think constituents, particularly where there's heritage issues, conservation issues, will be more proactive in resisting development, and therefore it's likely that the appeal system will come into use more and more, and with a presumption in favour of small sites, it's likely that more and more will be allowed on appeal. So it's
yeah, I'm just concerned. I'm interested because there's a presumption. There are two things. There's a presumption and there's a target. And if the target were, I don't know how you change it, weren't there, so to speak, you had the overall target, would you still get the same level of appeals because you've got a presumption?
I think it's likely. I think if it's not so much striving for that particular target, because one would hope that at the end of the day, any scheme, whether it's a large scheme or small scheme, is going to be decided upon the local plan policies across the spectrum of local plan policy, and obviously with consideration of engagement with the local community. But I think there will be an increased tension there, and with increased tension with the local community via councillors, it's likely that would drive up the appeal rate.
Okay, it seems to. And on the other point, related but other point, you would be arguing you're pro-growth, but you'd be arguing for flexibility in terms of where you put your growth, in terms of whether it's on bigger sites, as could be the case in Bexley if they have the transport infrastructure, or whether it's on where they can reach this target on small sites.
Absolutely, and I think the message is from all of us, I guess, the overall target, and let's not forget this, is going to be extremely challenging for most.
Yeah. The overall target's also challenging.
Yes, absolutely.
But you still want that flexibility.
Yes.
And is that true of Croydon?
I just want to pick a couple of things up, talking about appeals and stuff like that. What we're concerned about in terms of the overall target is that we won't be able to prove a 5-year land supply, and then what happens is you can end up in an appeal situation and the inspector will be falling back to MPPF, the presumption in favour of sustainable development. So that is our concern, is that we just can't show the 5-year land supply, and I actually imagine there's a lot of other London boroughs who will be in exactly the same position. That needs to be thought about.
Can I just say that this plan is not being, the Mayor's been written to by Secretary of State, is not being judged by the MPPF, the new MPPF.
Right. But that was in the old MPPF and the new MPPF. You've still got this presumption in favour of sustainable development, and there's the housing delivery.
Yeah, that's there, yes. I was just thinking about the 5 years.
Yeah, and you've got to show you've got a 5-year land supply. And if you've got these big targets, you can't necessarily show that. And that's when you could end up really losing at appeal. So that needs to be considered. How is planning going to carry on in London if we kind of basically throw all local plans and policy out the window because it comes down to the MPPF presumption in favour of sustainable development, because that's what could happen. So there's that issue, and we would say that we'd much prefer the Liverpool method to be taken on board in terms of looking at, because initially, specifically with these small sites, it's going to be very, very difficult to gear up local, small, medium-sized developers to get that sort of mindset, and members of the community and political members as well, and officers, to get into the mindset of delivering small sites. So it's going to take time to, I think, step up to this housing target. So I think we'd like to have the overall how, you know, you're not going to deliver the numbers in the early years. You might be able to get into the swing of it later on and deliver more at the end.
Transition, isn't it?
So the Liverpool method would be better. Just talking about appeals, we've done a huge amount of work to ensure we've got the most efficient DM system we can. And we've worked at sort of getting down roughly about 30 appeals each month down to about 8. Now that's good, and we're really pleased with that. And that's helped because we've got a new local plan. And it's also helped because we've got specific guidance now on how do you take forward small sites and intensification. So all the officers and developers know that there's much clearer advice out there how to take forward smaller sites. But at the same time, we're now having far more planning committees, and it's absolutely knackering because we used to have one every 2 weeks. We're now having one every week because of the sheer quantum of referrals and schemes that are objected to. And these are not big schemes, so you might have 250 objections to a scheme which is like 8, 9 flats, and they're just, you know, you sit in committee and you have loads of rejectors getting up there, loads of ward members coming in and objecting. And effectively the scheme goes through at the end of the day, but it's a huge resource and it is killing the department because you've got to be geared up for planning committee every single week, and it's not sustainable to be doing that. And we have a very supportive administration. We've got a local plan that sets out the right policy, and we've got the right sort of supplementary planning guidance that sets out the right policy. But the amount of time it is taking to get these small sites through needs to be factored in. They are not easy at all.
Okay, so it's resource intensive, and you think there should be a transition of some sort on this?
Yes.
What would that mean, a transition?
Well, again, it comes down to this sort of, being more flexible. So that how is it going to be dealt with in terms of this 5-year land supply issue?
Okay.
First of all, and then also, if we're not meeting it every single year, we've got time to catch up at the end, and that was the Liverpool method of assessing.
So it might come back to your point about phasing.
Yeah.
And transition. Okay, that's helpful. I'm going to ask members now if they've got any more questions around this, and otherwise we'll move on to the next question. No? Okay, Tony, are you coming in?
Yes, I'm asking Riëtte and then other members. Why do you think the Mayor now includes a modelling approach of calculating the need for small sites in the SLAR, please?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
Why do you think the Mayor now includes a modelling approach of calculating the need for small sites in the SLAR?
I suppose it's just to get a sense of what capacity there is within London, and there are various approaches you can do it because there's no recognised modelling approach. Something that I wanted to add to the previous discussion that might add to this as well, I think there is a bit of a discrepancy between national level planning policy and what is being required by the London Plan of boroughs in terms of brownfield registers, because the definition of what a small site is have changed. So brownfield registers used to be 0.25 hectares. We've done some research for CPRE to actually look at how boroughs identify small sites, and we found that they don't do proactive work because it's just too difficult. There are lots of resource issues, for example, with how planning policy officers relate to development control officers and how you estimate capacity of different sites. I think some of this discussion needs to distinguish that small sites isn't all homogeneous either. There are small sites that aren't developed that can actually facilitate 2, 4, 10 homes. They are the sites that sit within the planning process that are really difficult to get through planning. It is more difficult to get those sites through planning than it is to get a 28-storey tower through planning. So I think we do need to recognise, I think there's targets is clearly an issue, but I think we cannot just say that small sites aren't going forward, because it is part of the solution. I think it's finding the best ways of making it not too challenging, but actually starting to find proactive ways of promoting them.
Thank you, but just to press a bit further on that, be specifically, what are the alternates or the improvements to the modern approach that you think could be made, please?
I don't think there's any way apart from local authorities going to look at their own areas, and like Croydon to an extent have done, identified areas where they think there is capacity for further growth. So,
but to give an example, I think I heard the Chief Executive of Croydon give this with her own sites. If she has a whole lot of public sector sites herself and she can manage them effectively, that's one perhaps better way of doing it. But if they're all privately owned sites being developed by different developers, there's no real way that you can actually manage this process, is there?
you can, because the New London Plan and, well, the NPPF, which is not going to apply to the New London Plan, requires boroughs to look at these sites with specific design coding or guidance in place. So they need to develop a set of rules to assess these sites.
And has anybody actually done so? Of all the boroughs here, is one of you ahead of this?
I think we are. We've got a SBD 2, Supplementary Planning Document 2, out on intensification and bringing small sites forward. That is under consultation at the moment, and that is incredibly detailed in terms of how do you take these small sites forward. It provides design solutions, it looks at detailing, it looks at how, if you amalgamate plots, how do you deal with the tricky issues of overlooking, what it deals with character. It goes into incredible detail on all those things. To provide that additional guidance to developers and to our own officers as well. I mean, I'm not a massive fan of design codes because I think you can put a huge amount of time into design codes and you still need to apply them. But I think supplementary planning document with good guidance is a helpful way forward. And I know the GLA is doing some work on that because I think it's really helpful to share good practice. And I think we've learned a huge amount in terms of the couple of years that we've really been taking intensification forward. We also have our own housing development company, Brick by Brick, who took forward some really tricky sites because they were all council owned, things like garage forecourts and bits of leftover land, and they employed some really good architects, young architects, to come up with really good solutions, and we've learned from that. We've really tested things like overlooking distances. We use the levels of our land. How do you deal with car parking? Because if you knock down one house and put 9 flats back, there's a real issue about how much car parking goes in, how important it is to get the landscaping right, how do you deal with private and communal space, play space. So this SPD covers all those matters and is informed by real life solutions because it's happening right now in the borough.
Thank you. Does Ealing want to comment?
No. Could I just chip in? I mean, just on the brownfield registers point, I mean, one of the things that CPRE is keen to do, and it's done it in the past, it's done it in outside of London, in relation to the requirement for authorities to prepare urban capacity studies a few years back, and we've worked with local authorities to carry out very thorough urban capacity studies. We've done a little bit locally, for example, in Tower Hamlets over the past 20 years, in identifying 12 small sites, seriously small sites, well below 0.25 hectares, which have been actually developed within a radius of about 1 mile from the centre of one of the former Tower Hamlets neighbourhoods. So that delivered over 100 homes in the process. So there are ways in which you can go about, and we're working with community groups on the ground in some outer London boroughs to see whether or not we can compile our own brownfield registers and actually improve on the lack of activity for various reasons. I'm sure quite legitimate by some outer London boroughs, actually not to use the brownfield registers at all, really, as a tool for achieving small sites objectives. I'd be interested in local authorities' comments on that.
And Bexley wanted to comment, I think.
So I just wanted to go back to your original question, which is why you think the Mayor used the modelling approach.
Yes.
So I think that's a really important question, something that we should dwell on for a little bit. I think certainly from our point of view at Bexley, we think it's a desperate attempt by the Mayor to bridge the gap between the objectively assessed need figure that he has to deal with and the figures that were coming out of the SHLA. Figures coming out of the SHLA, predominantly from the large sites, were nowhere near that. So it is quite a desperate attempt to find some way of bridging that gap, given that there was no development in the green belt and also a move to protect employment land. I think that's a really important point that we should take note of. if you actually look at the SHLA and the justification for that modelling approach essentially is based on one figure, a 1% annual increase in the amount of growth coming out of existing residential areas. How's that justified within the SHLA methodology? It's a reasonable estimate in view of the impact of the proposed policy. That's all it says to justify that figure. That needs to be challenged. I just want to pick up another point actually that was made by a colleague from the architects. We have a permissive policy in Bexley. We allow backland development when there is no harm. That is exactly what the draft London plan says in its presumption in favour of small sites. If we were to approve every single application for small sites that came to us, and we approve the majority, but if we were to approve all of them, we would have completed, since 2006, 192 units from small sites, not the 860 that we have in the London plan. These targets are not achievable simply on the basis of a change in London plan policy.
It's a point I was going to come on to actually, is in terms of how we approach small sites, and whatever the response is either at a planning policy level or indeed a supplementary planning guidance document level, essentially the planning system is laying the foundations down in a policy sense for allowing things to happen, whether that's a presumption in principle or application of policy, has always been the case. The model that perhaps we need to look at is how do we create a model of deliverability. We all have authorities where we're proactive with our own asset management on our own estates, whether that's on the bigger sites or indeed the smaller sites through release. But how do we bridge that gap? And that's exactly the discussion we had when we were with HTA on suburbia, is how do we bridge that gap as authorities with very little resource, let's face it, to encourage the type of community development that's not just looking at neighbourhood planning but neighbourhood development. And you know, is it necessary to develop some extra resource to give that expertise where you have one or two individuals in the neighbourhood that can see that there's intensification that could happen, but how do they go about getting that on the ground? Now, historically, they would come to the planning authority. The planning authority is not in a position anymore to develop hundreds of planning briefs, whatever they would mean, for hundreds of different small sites, nor is it able nowadays to give free advice to these communities. So therefore, where is that expertise, where is that assistance going to come from? And indeed, is there any financial assistance in putting together these sites? So, you know, that's equally a challenge, I think.
Can we hold that about tools and the assistance, because we've got a question a bit later on, which I think Navin will be asking around that, because it's an important point you've raised. You know, how can you bridge the gap?
I think that you're on now, Tom.
Am I on now? Fantastic. So I want to move us on to the SHMAR, the 2017 SHMAR. We as a committee, well, certainly raised eyebrows looking at the size mix that was contained within the SHMAR and the emphasis on smaller homes, and particularly, I think it's 55% one-bed flats. So my question, I'll start with Heather, and I'm interested to hear what the other boroughs have to say about this as well. How does the 2017 SHMAR reflect your experience on the locally assessed need for smaller homes compared with the previous SHMAR's emphasis more on larger homes?
I'm going to think hard about this. I'm just trying to think through. Our SHMAR, the SHMAR was saying we need family homes in the borough, and that is what I think we've got a 60% target of new homes, 60 or 70% new target in our local plan for all new homes to be 3 beds or more.
60 or 70?
I think it's 60, it's either 60 or 70% is the requirement. So we have a real need for family homes.
When was your last borough Shmar?
It's only about 217, it's the most recent one, I can't, sorry.
Right.
Is it the one you're using in your response, the London plan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is a real need for family homes, which we do seek that as a strategic target,
Yes.
but we know that we're not going to get anywhere near to that. So we've got a policy that seeks a range of typologies for all sites that are major sites. For sites of 1 to 9, there is more flexibility within it. And that's important because if you are bringing forward small sites, for instance, you need to have the ability to be flexible in terms of, you can't just sort of, if you want to bring the whole site forward, you've got to trade something off effectively. But what we are finding is that sometimes small sites can deliver more family homes, which is what we need, because they don't want to go above 9, because then they become a major, then they get affordable housing, they get all the other things that kick in. So they prefer to do, like, I don't know, 2, 3-bed units, instead of and keep it below 9. So I do think that the smaller sites can help contribute to us meeting our family housing target in a good way. And often they're in more suburban locations and they've got big gardens, so you can provide the outdoor amenity space as well. And because they've got lower P-towels, you don't want to have a load of 1-bed flats bunged in there either. So that works out quite helpful for us.
But across the board, not just small sites, but sort of in general. I mean, do the figures that are contained within its table 4.3 in the plan based on the Shmar, do they look right to you? Do they feel right?
I think my recollection is that they're still above what we feel that we can do. We've done some work around it, and we can probably hit that figure, but the figure we've been given, they don't match up, from my recollection. Right. You're probably asking me a really detailed question.
No, it's okay.
My manager of planning policy would get involved in. So probably one of these experts down here would.
We've got planning policy managers here.
We do. Well, I'll move along to Bexley. I'm particularly sort of keen to hear whether or not you think that the figures there are going to lead to an oversupply of smaller homes and not enough family homes.
Well, I'll defer to my expert in a second. But yes, in essence. The demand in Bexley, and we have commissioned our own Shmar, and it's been delayed because we got a bit tripped up with some GDPR issues, but the early indications are that the ongoing trend is for larger family homes, and actually is also for extra care type facilities. So that's another typology, because Bexley has an ageing population more distinct than other parts of London as well, and we don't actually have one extra care scheme in Bexley, so there's another nuance there. But currently I think we are heading towards potentially an oversupply of smaller units. But Seb, is there anything to add?
I think that's generally right. Oversupply of smaller units to be acquired locally.
Right, thank you. Ealing.
Yeah, we're taking the sub-regional approach, and we're in the middle of looking at West London.
Which boroughs are included in?
I'll hand you over to Sam, because I don't want to steal his thunder, because he's the expert on this.
So it's all of the boroughs you'd expect in West London, plus also Barnet. They've come in as well. They're part of West London Alliance. So it is a sub-regional study. It will produce borough-specific outputs. I didn't actually bring the borough figures. I brought the sub-regional figures, and they don't reflect the London Shmar at all. So the draft figures at the moment, which were completed according to what's now the current methodology, but government's already announced that they intend to revise it, didn't show a 55% requirement for 1-beds. It showed a 17.5% requirement for 1-beds. And then the bulk of demand is actually in 2 and 3 beds, so it's 40% for 2 beds and 29% for 3 beds.
Well, this is, I mean, we're sort of building a picture where we've heard much higher figures from other boroughs. We've heard at previous committee meetings, Havering identified a need of 80% for family-sized housing in their Shmar. And it does seem Well, it just seems counterintuitive to me that over the planned period, that would mean, the figures in there would mean 900,000 new one-bedroom flats being built in London. So
I mean, there was a bit of analysis in the report, and certainly the consultant speculated that what it would effectively mean was that everybody in potential need of a one bed, including those who either wouldn't receive housing benefit or couldn't pay for it themselves, would have to take up a one bedroom flat in order to occupy that total supply. Yes. Yes.
A point that I would just like to add to that is that developers like to build 1 and 2 bedroom flats because that's all they can sell at the moment. So I think it's a question about affordability, and it's a real shame that the new London plan isn't assessed according to the new NPPF, because the definition of affordable housing is a lot wider, and discounted market sale, for example, is being included in there. So there is a real issue around families who are trying to access housing products. And the SHMA actually at the moment is at paragraph 8.9 that seems to suggest that that need will be accommodated through downsizing. So I think there is a issue around that policy that you can't set it for a private and a shared ownership mix. I think the other point is that just having a policy is not necessarily going to deliver those homes, because I think we've done a little bit of research, and I don't have those figures here now. If you look at the, just in one borough I think we've had a look at, if you look at the number of schemes that have gone through with a housing mix different from the policy mix, the larger schemes are far less likely to actually meet it, whereas the smaller sites actually are more likely to accord to a housing mix set by policy. So I think it's just, it's not as simple as just a policy would lead to behaviour. There's an affordability thing, and there's the ability for who builds homes and what they can sell it for.
that's true, and and I do understand as well the argument that I think the GLA makes about not setting the size up to market, which is 2/3 of markets, family-sized market sale homes are sold to private landlords. They're not actually occupied by families. So I do understand that, but of course it doesn't mean they're always going to be owned by private landlords. You know, over the lifetime, the market can change and families can move in. I just wondered if either of our other two guests wanted to contribute on this point before I finish the question of size mix.
Well, it's really just following on from what Riëtte's saying about affordability, because well, I mean, 2 points really. One is I think the London SHMA clearly covers a very wide range of circumstances, and I would imagine that with the sub-regional SHMAs will give you a better fine-grained approach to this issue. I would imagine that the huge preponderance of one-bed homes indicated by the London SHMA is largely related to the inner London boroughs rather than the outer London equally. But the point I was going to make in terms of affordability is that the Smith Institute's report on pricing London as Eden, not ours, of a few years ago, was quite interesting on the ability of housing development in outer London to actually meet some of London's affordable housing needs, just simply because of the huge disparity in average house prices between inner and outer London. I think it was 9 times, most expensive boroughs were 9 times that of the most affordable outer London boroughs. So I think I think there is an issue here about looking at how new housing can be made to work harder in outer London boroughs in terms of tackling the affordability challenge.
Thank you.
Okay. Tom, can I just ask, do any boroughs have a surplus of one-bed flats at the moment? Or think they've got enough kind of thing?
By what definition, in terms of vacant flats or
unpurchased?
Well, I wonder what we've heard anecdotally that some boroughs say, look, we've got too many already. And I don't know quite what they mean by that, but so I'm asking. More than they need, or more than are being filled up? No?
I suspect we have people living in one-bedroom flats who should actually be living in larger properties. But I suspect we have people who live in a one-bedroom flat but actually should be living in larger properties.
Overcrowded.
So just as an aside, Bexley has seen very significant inward migration. And I think we've had over the last 3 to 4 years the largest surge in applications for school places, for example. So that's how in part I would measure that. And so that's also given us a bit of an insight into how our private rented sector stock is being used as well. And so it's far more common now that in the PRS sector, you may have a family with 2 children living in a 1-bedroom flat. So I don't think we do have voids. There's an affordability issue. So we don't have £800,000 1-bedroom flats in Bexley, for example. So they tend to be more affordable. An awful lot do slip into the private rented sector, and there's probably a significant level of overcrowding. But because a lot of it is in the private sector, it isn't that easy for us to tap into. But it certainly isn't like areas in other inner London boroughs where there's whole tower blocks and you can drive past at night and not see a light on.
Yeah, okay. But that's not the case for Ealing, say. You don't have overcrowded 1-bed flats.
No, I think our experience would be quite similar. In that certainly we're not seeing voids of units, but occupancy of units isn't necessarily the number, the London Plan space standard requirement for those units. So we'll see, for instance, people in private rental flats will be, will be sharing more than the room occupancy level that would be specified by the space standard.
It does seem that if you build a very large amount of 1-bed flats and less, 16% 2-bed and 29% family, then you're likely to be a lot of target groups will they'll either not be able to live in London or they'll move into the 1-beds and be overcrowded maybe. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And certainly we're not seeing voids of towers of 1-beds either, unlike Central London.
Okay. Yes. Navin.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Pretty much with one voice, all borough representatives have said how challenging the targets are in terms of their delivery, and need for flexibility and further assessment, etc. On the issue about those challenges, what will be some of the challenges of identifying appropriate small sites, given the fact that already all of you are doing pretty much a lot of work on small sites. So here there's pressure to find additional small sites at a very large scale. So what are the challenges involving that? You want to start, David?
I think the challenges are twofold. One, it's really identifying sites that perhaps we are unaware of, and I think, as my colleagues are saying, so much work is being done now to alleviate the pressures for additional housing, full stop, that the obvious sites have already been identified or are coming up. And then purely from a resource point of view, actually going out, if we can go out and identifying the very small sites that we're not aware of is a huge resource ask. And I know, Sam, from the policy team, if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about small sites is by definition we don't know what they are. We don't identify the site in advance. In some sense, it's almost, from a plan-making perspective, it's almost a no-sites policy, because you're not identifying land, which you know about in advance, and then facilitating development on it. You're making a speculation that sites which are currently occupied by development of one or another sort, mainly being within the curtilage of an existing house, for example, you're speculating that a proportion of those will come forward during the plan. So I think the resourcing of trying to identify those is one thing. It's too many sites being chased by too few officers with too little information, but it turns more into less of a capacity issue and more of a question of how do you actually deliver those sites. So you could take the methodology that's used in Policy H2 basically speculates about what the physical capacity of those sites is, which may or may not be a reasonable estimate. But the thing that's not supported in any way, which colleagues alluded to earlier, is the 1% per annum target. The only thing we know about that currently in Ealing's case is that we're realising houses at a rate of roughly 300 a year rather than the 1,000 that the methodology would give for us. So all we know about the 1% figure is currently we're only delivering a third of it.
You mentioned, in a sense, capacity and resources. That was going to be my next question, in terms of what additional support you reckon would you need to better deliver those small sites? Because already, you know, there's, you mentioned about too few offices, etc. So there is that capacity issue. So what do you think we will help the boroughs to, have better kind of team, better resources?
To be honest, it's probably about a different skill set than we would normally use in a site identification or analysis process. It's probably more about trying to come up with tools that facilitate the delivery of those sites, whether it's a particular model of financing or units which can be delivered faster or something like that. I think attempting to plan for sites which are fundamentally uncertain the planning process wouldn't be helped by additional officer resources. It's almost a question of looking at it from how do you incentivise or how do you deliver those small units rather than how do we plan for them.
I'd agree with that entirely, and I think there's something just fundamental about the sites themselves. We're a very small landowner. Our housing stock transferred about 18 years ago, so as a local authority we have little to catalyse change with, really. So there's something about incentivising people to bring their sites forward, but they are complex, and these small sites do suck out far more resource both from the developers and ourselves than the larger sites do, and there is rarely a site that is straightforward, that you get covenants that suddenly get unearthed. So I just genuinely think this is hugely challenging, but would support everything that Sam just said. So.
A couple of things. I think there is things you can do as a local authority, and then you don't need to go out and do it all because developers will do it for you. And what I mean is that if you have the right policy context which encourages small sites to come forward, that's pretty positive. And you send the right messages out. But you have to understand your borough, and we have the borough character appraisal, and we've done really detailed work so we can understand what are the areas that we think small sites will come forward in, what is the typologies there. So we have a good understanding, and from that we've identified 4 zones of intensification particularly. So whilst we're happy to do intensification throughout the borough, and we say, we want development as a minimum of 3 stories throughout the borough, but that is dependent on character. We've also identified 4 specific zones of intensification where you have areas like district centres or potential neighbourhood centres where you've got good infrastructure but it's not fully utilised. You've got quite low density housing around it. So we've said of those 4 areas, development could be a lot bigger in those areas to use the infrastructure that's already there. And what's interesting by having all that positive policy context is that the developers go out there and ID the sites for you. And so we have in Croydon quite a growing collection of specialist small to medium-sized developers who are going out there and they are knocking on people's doors and they're asking to buy their houses. And this can be a positive and a negative. Yeah. It's a positive in that they're bringing forward the sites. It's a negative in the sense that there are sometimes vulnerable elderly people in their houses, and one of the consultation events we've done recently for our supplementary planning document, we had people telling, and they said, they've had 5 or 6 developers knocking on their doors wanting an option on their house, and they feel a little bit hounded by this. So on one hand, that is the market and it's working, and it's interesting because the community is sort of on one hand saying, we don't want intensification, it's going to change the character of our area. But when somebody is waving a lot of money under their noses, that is actually changing their ideas. And they're thinking, well, maybe we can downsize, maybe we can move out. And so that is actually happening, and that's why a lot of those sites are coming forward. And in several streets in Croydon, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 houses are coming forward and being redeveloped. And we now know certain roads. We go, oh yeah, that's that road. It's coming forward. So it's get the right policy context. That's helpful. I'm not sending officers out saying you identify specific sites at all.
It's so interesting actually what you just said, because you're saying that it is being facilitated in a sense by the private sector. But are they actually looking at people downsizing within their own community?
Well, we do want to ensure that people can downsize, and one of the problems we've got is that, as I said, the south of our borough is large detached houses, and people do want to stay in that community, but they don't want to live in a 5-bed house. They want to move down to a 2-bed or a 3-bed, and there isn't that much around at the moment. And that's why we see it fought out in planning committee, because people say we must have these family houses, we can't have flats, as if flats were something terrible. But actually they're there for people of all ages and types of their life, and I think that's a very positive thing, and that's what we're talking to communities about, is that it does provide choice for people to be able to stay in their communities, and that's a positive message from small site redevelopment.
But they don't want to move into 1-bed flats, they'd rather move into 2 or 3.
I think, yes, people would find it hard, I think, to go from a 5-bed to a 1-bed. But as I said earlier, I think the small sites do provide opportunities for a wider range of typologies than potentially inner city living.
They also need to be accessible. If you're talking about elderly residents moving or downsizing, their accommodation will also need to be accessible. And that is something should be key to what provision is required.
Indeed, and the London plan is very supportive about, I think it specifically requires ground floor flats to be accessible, and that's important because we have this debate about, we need more bungalows. Well, actually, a flat that is accessible provides just as good an accommodation for somebody with accessibility mobility needs as a bungalow.
Yeah. I do have a question here which says, will it be possible to identify how residential conversions can contribute to small sites? Is that exactly
what
we're talking about?
We do have residential conversions. From a sustainability point of view, they are better. So, for instance, there was one at committee only last week, which is like a large detached house that was converted into floor flats, and then there was 2 units in the rear garden. So that was extending the existing premises and building in the back garden as well. So there is opportunities there. Yeah. The thing I would say is that we do also have a policy about safeguarding family houses of 130 square metres and less, because you do want to retain those family homes, the smaller ones as well.
Question is what's the proportion of such conversions coming forward, and are you actually actively promoting that as well as policy for it to come on the market?
Yes, we're very happy with conversions. Because they are more sustainable, and it can often help retain character, and I think it could go down better with the community. When we often hear communities say, we much prefer this house to be extended rather than totally redeveloped. So we're open to it, and we don't have an issue at all with conversions. I think.
Can I just come in on that? When they're converted, are they for rent or for sale?
Depends who converts them.
Because family housing is a very flexible housing stock, and if it's changed into for sale, then it's very hard to.
I would have thought generally it would be for sale, isn't it? If there are private dwellings being brought up or being converted.
Generally, it's for sale, but it really depends on who the developer or the investor is at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay. Do you want to come in and this?
I think the challenge around identifying appropriate small sites. There's the current tool of local authorities using brownfield registers of sites 0.25 hectares and larger. At the moment, the research that we've done, officers basically use sites identified in SMAR already, so there isn't any process of actually proactively going to search for these potential small sites, and there is a question about, can new ways be put in place of actually encouraging communities to identify some of these sites and bring it forward. I don't think we should always think that people won't support this type of thing. If people can think about it themselves, we might be surprised. And then, of course, when a site is on a brownfield register, there is the whole process of planning permission in principle, which could be problematic maybe, but it's an existing planning tool that exists. And I think, I would support what Heather has said, well, if you do something else, which is actually encouraged by the NPPF, is about thinking about local character in paragraph 122, and also thinking about whether you want character to effectively change, identify proactively some areas of your borough because you have looked at it, then I think you will see different behaviours coming forward. So, but that's not necessarily going to help you to assess exactly how many of those sites there are.
Thank you. Can I get responses from the three borough representatives on issues which already flagged up to do with small sites posing challenges to transport and infrastructure capacity, and issue about character of the locality, and also perhaps something comments on conservation area implications as well. Maybe we will start again from
I think small sites obviously by definition tend to be surrounded by either existing residential or existing commercial, and therefore are more likely to throw up issues to do with the relationship with the existing urban fabric, impact of proposed new development or indeed conversion on the local surrounding residential occupiers. We see that probably not regularly at planning committee, but it's a definite concern with our members and their constituents, where you move away from the developed town centres into what we call the hinterland, where the P-towers drop off. Obviously then transport becomes the issue with local residents. You know, the capacity of local highways, particularly the demands for on-site car parking if it's not provided on-site. We have 29 conservation areas. Of course, some of these small sites are going to be located within those, and they throw up a whole range of heritage issues as well. So they're not typically easy sites, and I just echo what's already been said. They're more difficult in many ways to take through the planning system. They're more resource intensive in terms of negotiations of our planning officers with the developers who may not be as expert as the planning consultants on larger sites. There is always the issue of viability looming large, where developers will be saying there's no way we can afford a tariff on sites less than 9 units, and where they fall into the category of major developments over 10 to 25, for instance, where we are requiring a proportion on site. We have small schemes that have been locked in negotiation for anywhere between 12 and 18 months, trying to figure out whether they're actually viable on the ground. So they are difficult in their own rights to take through the planning system.
In addition to infrastructure, there always are challenges when you're developing small sites or conversions of small residential buildings, and that is to do with waste disposal, because you have an average 2 to 3 bins for a unit.
Yep.
When you have 2 or 3 on the same site,
yep,
that is another challenge. As car parking, you look at sustainability and all the arguments. At the same time, that also becomes an issue.
Absolutely.
Now, is this something, given the sort of level of development we're looking at, something which needs to be looked into as part of strategic policy?
I think it's covered in all our policy requirements, and I can't speak for other boroughs, but certainly in terms of the caseload that I see in terms of complaints, where you have small scale conversion of property, one of the biggest complaints is where's the refuse going to be?
Yes.
Where are these car parking facilities, car parking, cycle parking facilities going to be? It's that changing of the front of the site that 15, 20 years ago would have been due to putting 1 or 2 car parking spaces on it. Now it's about refuse and it's about cycle parking.
Navin, Tom needs to go, is that right, Tom?
Yes.
So we just have to agree one thing before you go, Tom.
Yeah.
Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion so far? And can I ask the committee to delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree to use the information from today's discussion as part of the committee's participation in the forthcoming London Plan examination in public?
All right, that is agreed.
We're fine with that.
Sorry, I have to go. Yeah.
Yes. As the chair, that is the formal part of the
Yes.
business over committee may wish to.
No, I mean, we've got a couple more questions, haven't we?
Yeah, I'm okay for time.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, normally this meeting doesn't take place at this time of the day, so it was difficult for members to schedule in their diaries. Whereas we're very pleased you've all scheduled it. Thank you.
yeah.
Navin.
Okay, well, if we can carry on with the dialogue about infrastructure and what else was it? Character issue. So, Jane.
Again, it's really nice when someone else goes first, because I just have to say yes, I agree with that. I think, however, for us, the issue would not be about bicycle parking. It would be about car parking still in converted buildings, because Bexley still does have, unfortunately, because of the lack of public transport infrastructure, a very high car usage. In fact, it's bucking the London trend and it's increasing. With regards to the character in our conservation areas, we have seen some conversions, not many. I suspect, unlike Croydon, I'm not sure, but I suspect unlike Croydon, the character of our housing stock is very different. Most of our housing stock is actually post-war, so we don't have a proliferation of large villas set on quite significant plots. What we do tend to have, we have some Victorian premises, but most of them do tend to be post-war semis and terraces of varying scale that don't lend themselves quite as readily and quite as easily, possibly, to some of the properties that are being targeted in Croydon. I don't know that for sure, but my instinct would be that that might in part be the case, that our housing stock is far more sort of post-war and even 60s and 70s.
Well, I think I talked about conversions. Your general question was about opportunities.
For the character and also in terms of what implications or impact on on infrastructure.
Implications on infrastructure. As I said earlier, I mean, the real concern is that we are obviously trying to meet the Mayor's transport plan strategy targets and to get to an 80% of sustainable modes of transport by 2041, and so we are seeking to contain and control car parking. That's a key way of doing it, but we do also have to bear heed to the fact that some of these small sites have got very low P-towers. What we are doing, we've agreed with TfL to undertake a bus review, a borough bus review of routes, and I think this is really, really important, because we have, in Croydon, we've got good north-south movements, but we've got very poor east-west, and in the south of the borough we've got areas with, you know, not great bus movements and services at all. So that bus review is really important. We are promised by the Mayor and the TfL that bus services are going to move from inner London to the outer London boroughs, and we need to see that happen on the ground, so that when residents quite rightly object to, you know, smaller sites and housing coming forward at higher densities, we can say, well, look, this is going to help support bus movements, you know, but bus travel. We also have a very clear walking and cycling strategy as well. In Croydon we are challenged because we've got quite significant topography, so we're looking at doing things like e-bikes. But we do need to have more trams. That's another thing, really, really important. So infrastructure is important. It's chicken and egg. In one point, you know, having higher densities through small sites intensification can help support more infrastructure like shops and local services, which is really plus. But in terms of transport, we do need more help from TfL and GLA in ensuring that that is there.
I absolutely agree. Unfortunately, I mean, I welcome there's a current consultation out for the bus network to do with in London. There isn't one that I know about planned in the near future for a similar strategic review of outer London bus network. So critical given the kind of development that we're talking about, not just small sites and intensification, but bigger sites as well, you know, the opportunity areas and so on. Those require that additional priority, greater priority for public transport network, which doesn't quite exist. And areas like Bexley or northwest London, like Arrow, which I represent, or going beyond Harlington, where we do need that additional priority for public transport, which needs to be there, which currently doesn't exist, unfortunately. Something that's
something we should be pressing for. We absolutely should be pressing for.
Yeah.
Robin, do you want to come in?
I just wanted to broaden the point about infrastructure from a Hayes, a local community perspective. We're very concerned about the adequacy of present levels of health, social and community infrastructure, and trying to cope with the present burdens or pressures from development. That's an overriding issue locally, and recently the Harlington Council with the GLA published a development infrastructure funding study for Hayes Town, which revealed that we need 5 forms of entry primary school now, immediately. That was a great surprise to everyone, except those with children of school age. Anyway.
That's point well made, social infrastructure.
And just a point I also want to make is that from reading the first edition of the integrated impact assessment into the draft new London plan, there was no real discussion of the equalities impact of this policy H2 on small sites. Whether or not that has been addressed by the revised version of the IIA, I can't say because I hadn't read it in depth, but I just wanted to alert you to the just space response on that particular aspect of policy H2 and the lack of consideration of the equalities dimension. We don't know what will be the impact, cumulative impact of all the small site developments on vulnerable communities, neighbourhoods, because we're not all, well, Bexley's still here, but we're not all well appointed suburbanites. There is a great diversity locally in Hayes, which has enriched our community.
Thanks for bringing that to table. Thank you. Chair, I think I'm done.
I think so, because I think we've dealt with conservation. As a wrap-up question, you have an appendix at the back of the briefing you were sent, which goes through all the questions or matters with supplementary questions that the inspector is currently asking. And we still have a couple of days to put in other questions around this topic and other topics, but we're on this topic. And there is a question which talks about, you still have to read it out for me, what is it, about transition?
Yes, so it's question M19G, which is what will happen in the interim pending the work to prepare area-wide design codes referred to in policy H2B2. That's
just to give you an idea of one of the questions that's there. And the inspectors were always asking, is there going to be a transition period? And I'm just wondering around, the points that were made around phasing, and I think it was Helen who said it, wasn't it? In terms of...
Well, David said it, and I agreed that there needs to be some sort of transition approach. And I think fundamentally there's an issue because local plans work on a 20-year lifespan as well.
Sorry, local plans?
Local plans work on 20-year lifespans and London plans work on 10. And so there's a bit of discussion about what is the actual housing target that you are dishing out to local boroughs, because we have to plan on 20-year time periods. So if you set...
But you've been given... How long are your targets for? 10 years?
Ours is for 20 years, yours are for 10.
Yeah, so we've given you 10-year targets.
Yes, but when we do our next iteration of the local plan, we have to look at it in a 20-year planning horizon. So what is the target that we need to identify? And there's a discussion about, do we go with the 10-year one that is given by the London plan and then possibly revert to a SHMA-derived one? We could do it that way. Or do we revert to our old local plan target? I mean, what is it?
So what would be the question?
So I think there needs to be some understanding of what the ultimate housing target would be, because it's quite confusing at times. You talk to people, you've got an annual housing target, so for ours, under the new London plan, it's 2,949, and you're saying that's for 10 years, but what happens after 10 years? Because our new local plan will need to plan for 20 years. Do we take on that number over the whole 20-year lifetime of the plan, or do we stop at year 10? I mean, which we can't really do.
When is your new London, when is your own next development plan?
Well, since we adopted it in 2018, February, we'll be doing one, and we're going to kick straight off as soon as the new London plan is out, because we need to bring ours into accordance with your the new London plan. So it will happen in the next 2-3 years.
Wouldn't the kind of revised household projections be as important as whatever the London plan ultimately says? I mean, in terms of that post 10-year period.
It's all a bit, I don't know.
Yeah. We don't know yet. We don't know whether the ONS projections for either population or household growth are going to, it's really looking at a reduction in both population and household growth, and whether they're going to be taken on board in this London plan. But if they're not, they'll be immediately looked at in an alteration that'll come forward for sure. So will the new, and the new NPPF will be taken on board too.
There's always a backlog. People never hit the target. So
it makes it very complicated. I'm just wondering, we'll have to try and work out a question from that. What about other things that might be relevant to ask the inspector? Which is
affordable housing is a really key issue, and I'm really pleased that the London plan is challenging the NPPF in terms of affordable housing on sites of 1 to 9, because the NPPF, the new one, is saying that you can't ask for a contribution for sites of 1 to 9, and the London plan is challenging that and saying, well, actually, I think local circumstances should dictate that, and I think that's really important, because we are looking with the new housing target from the London plan that 50% of our housing is going to be provided through smaller sites. We've got a 91% requirement for affordable housing in the borough. If we can't negotiate or get any sort of contribution on those smaller sites, we're going to not meet our affordable housing target whatsoever. So I think something around that is really, really important.
That's a really good point.
And equally to extend Section 106 even further, not just affordable housing.
Sorry, Riëtte, can you just
to extend, because you can actually apply Section 106 then further, not just the affordable. I think I completely agree with Heather's point, but then also the questions around infrastructure, like schools or local health, and all the things that Section 106 used to do, that you can directly say, well, this is being spent back in that area. I think if boroughs are facing this level of growth, there should be more emphasis on getting some value.
More emphasis? Sorry, I find it hard to hear.
To actually make contributions to wider infrastructure as well in the borough, if this level of growth is
from small sites?
Yeah.
Well, you can get that from SIL. You can apply SIL to small sites.
But can local communities see the impact? I think that's the discussion.
Won't that be a burden on some of these rather smaller developers? And
all comes down to viability at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
I mean, you will get your SIL from the smaller sites, but I think the work we've done around viability in smaller sites is there is an issue there, which is why we're not demanding affordable housing is provided on sites. We're asking for what would be good is to get a contribution, a financial contribution. So, because you get developments of 1 to 9 at the moment, they have to pay SIL, and we think from doing some viability work that from between about 9 to about 15 housing units, that's a real tricky area to try and make work, because suddenly you get by affordable housing, carbon zero, a whole range of other things, because it becomes a major application. And so there's a real issue about how do you make that size site work. So you can probably do something below 9, and you can probably do something around about 20, but it's those sort of sites in the middle which are quite difficult, and that's where if you can do site assembly and bring a number of different parcels together, that might make this more viable.
Any other points around? I mean, there's a lot of questions here, aren't there? From the inspector.
Yes.
There are many questions on this particular issue. Are there any you think that there are gaps?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head,
reading these. It's really what help the Mayor can give through the London Plan and also outside the London Plan in accelerating deliverability, which you've all said is an issue, and often because it's very resource intensive, or there are barriers with objections and so on.
Certainly, specifically on the small sites methodology, the current approach is entirely capacity based. So it's based on estimating there's a certain physical capacity. It would be good to see, I mean, it's kind of hinted at in question B, which talks about how realistic to achieve this, would it be to achieve the target. But there is another component to it, which is what delivery mechanism does the policy actually provide? Because at the moment it looks solely as if there's a kind of there's a policy ethic, if you like, which is to encourage these sites, but actually what identified delivery mechanism exists to provide, well, to triple, in Ealing's case, the amount of housing coming forward from small sites.
How would you answer that question yourself? If you asked, what would you want as delivery mechanisms, what would you say?
I think there would have to be a strategy around asking the question, first of all, what's the obstacle? So if officers at the GLA, for example, had identified a huge backlog of permissions which were currently being refused, that's a potential area where a policy approach would work. If, however, that doesn't exist, it suggests you need an approach to encourage development to come forward along the line of what Heather was talking around about in terms of area character assessments, and something more constructive than just saying this is a target and there's a presumption in favour of it. But if you're currently not receiving applications for those types of units, that's very unlikely to achieve anything by itself.
Interesting. By the way, I mean, there is I can't remember where, but there is a section which talks about how you've got to do evaluations of growth capacity, character assessments, tall buildings. I mean, there are about 6 different things that you're all being asked to do.
Well, that's right, but it doesn't relate them specifically to strategies which could help achieve the small sites figure.
Oh, okay, that's a good point.
I mean, this may not be, well, it certainly won't be straightforward, but it comes back to the point I made earlier about the need for institutional capacity to help deliver on the ground, and whether or not there's the scope for the Mayor or GLA to set up some kind of unit within City Hall, which is actually focused on an urban land commission or something, which is actually focused on promoting best practice and providing tools for authorities, if you like, to learn from the strategic approach adopted by boroughs like Croydon, so that that sort of can be rolled out. And I do think, coming back to the neighbourhood point and the community point, I do genuinely think there's capacity, certainly in those areas in outer London where people are very concerned about the potential loss of green space to development, where they're actually themselves beginning to ask, well, what are the alternatives? And they're often communities that are very willing to go out and tramp the streets and look at underused vacant land. I mean, it's not only there's been a hell of a very strong focus in the discussion on getting small sites out of residential areas. I mean, I think there's a vast different reservoirs of capacity in sort of disused garages. I think low density single story high streets in some outer London areas, where you can actually get employment gains as well as residential gains on the back of a small site focus. And
it does, of course, include raising the levels.
Well, absolutely, raising the levels to 2 or 3 stories. They don't have to be tall buildings. Service car parks. I mean, the revolution that's happening in retail has been happening over the last 10 years in retail. Will no doubt continue. I think presents all sorts of interesting opportunities for a strategic approach.
While we're talking about that, I just want to add in that I do think modular housing, factory-built homes, is very good for difficult sites, and it also can go over utilities. It's got very shallow foundations, so some of those complicated sites would lend themselves to factory-built homes, and that means you don't get the noise and the dust and so on. Just slots in. May work for small sites. Riëtte, do you want to say anything about the question we might ask, and then I think we'll close.
Something I was just wondering about is the GLA commissioned consultants to do several work streams on the new housing design SPG.
On the housing?
On the housing design SPG.
Yeah, they're doing one now.
There were 2 work streams specifically that had to be brought forward for the examination in public, and one of them would have been about guidance to boroughs around small sites delivery, so guidance on design code, but also partly how you would assess infrastructure needs and capacity. So some of these questions being posed, consultants have been appointed to bring forward 2 work streams to actually look at those, and I don't know whether this will suddenly appear in the examination public process or whether it's already been published, those 2 specific work streams, but that was always the idea about it, to actually...
I'm sure it'll be used,
Yeah.
even if it's not published, it'll be used as part of what the Mayor's going to bring forward to help boroughs. Well, unless others have got ideas for questions we can ask or resources they would like to have, I think we'll close. No more. Is that right?
Sorry, Robin.
Oh, Robin, okay.
Just the questions, whether or not it was probing whether the policy will actually result in the creation of community-led housing by small builders and self-build housing.
That is mentioned somewhere, isn't it, Reece? That's I think that's part of what's...
It's a general support for bringing forward community-led development, and David referred to this earlier on as one of the tools, and I didn't think it was sufficiently explored within the question. Anyway,
Right.
that's just I want.
I think we picked up issues about the capacity in terms of local small builders, and Heather talked about how developers are sort of on their own, approaching residents and so on. So I think that bit was taken up. Other aspects that you mentioned haven't, but that is something. If you have any comments, you can, always write to the committee. This applies to everyone. Anything that we've either missed out or want to add on what's been deliberated today. So that's something we'll definitely welcome.
But what you're saying is that these sites lend themselves to community-led housing.
Yes.
And
there's growing government support, financial support for community-led housing.
And there's what?
schemes. There's growing government support for
Yes.
community-led housing schemes.
Yeah.
I don't know how far
I
that's
think there's
extending in
something, maybe not under this, but there's
Yes.
it's very favourable towards community-led housing, the London Plan, isn't it? My understanding it is. It's just exactly where...
It's making the linkage, I think.
But making the linkage is important. I was trying to make the link to modular. Well, I did make the link to modular, but I think we should make the link to community-led housing as well.
Yes. Does refer to neighbourhood planning, which is a possible way of delivering on small sites.
And getting local acceptance.
But the actual support by the GLA for neighbourhood planning in those areas that are devoid of people with skill sets and attitudes to do neighbourhood planning in the more vulnerable communities, that's missing.
I think that's a really, really good point. We've raised it, the Assembly's raised it in our response, that the Mayor needs to actually resource. And it's not just leaving it to the boroughs, it's actually helping facilitate certain communities in being able to move forward on neighbourhood plans. Because on the whole, they need expertise.
Chair, I think this is something very important, very relevant, because when you look at when you get planning applications for these smaller site developments, etc., there is a lot of local concerns or response, or and that is something not quite captured. And I think it is critical, in terms of engaging with local residents, local communities, how best it is done proactively for smaller sites as well, as important as big projects. So something I think needs to be captured.
That's a good point.
Community engagement aspects.
Okay. Okay, well that's been ever so helpful. And also those points at the beginning about looking more flexibly at the balance of the way housing is delivered under the targets. was very helpful too. So can I thank you all very much?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nikki, 4.2.
GLA, Committee Room 4, Sound.